Hey guys, welcome to Lab 3, and today in lab we'll be measuring cardiac output, and with a focus on a non-invasive technique of estimating cardiac output. But before we get into this method, let's first remind ourselves what exactly is cardiac output. And it's the amount of blood pumped by the heart into the systemic circulation and is most often expressed as liters per minute. And as you exercise and increase your exercise intensity, if you run faster or bike harder, heart rate increases, and it increases progressively towards maximal values. And this increase in heart rate, combined with a slight increase in stroke volume, actually causes very large increases in blood flow to the working muscles. And this increase in blood flow is to provide more oxygen to meet the ATP demand. So cardiac output can be calculated as the product of stroke volume and heart rate. Now, also as you exercise, vasodilation is occurring in the active skeletal muscles. And this occurs so the increase in cardiac output can be directed to the active muscles. And at the same time, blood flow to the inactive muscles, so the kidneys or the gut, decreases. So again, even more blood can be redistributed to the active skeletal muscles. Now, due to this increase in cardiac output during exercise, combined with the vasoconstriction that occurs, arterial pressure or blood pressure rises during exercise. Therefore, the relationship between pressure, flow, and resistance is defined by this equation. So you can see that cardiac output is very central to several important relationships and is a very important cardiovascular measurement we can take. And the purpose of today's lab is to introduce you guys to a technique or a method to estimate cardiac output. And many of the classical methods of measuring cardiac output require very invasive techniques. And other techniques that are not invasive are very quite expensive. So today in lab, we'll be using an indirect technique that is very non-invasive to estimate cardiac output. And this technique is called the CO2 Rebreathe Method. But before we get into any specifics, let's first start with the Fick principle. And the Fick principle states that the uptake of oxygen by a tissue is the product of O2 delivery to that tissue and the difference in oxygen between the arterial side and the venous side of that tissue. So in other words, VO2 is equal to how much oxygen the tissue takes up multiplied by the blood flow to that tissue. And we can think about this at the level of a single tissue, but we can also think about it at the level of the whole body and whole body oxygen consumption, where the delivery of oxygen to the body is cardiac output, and the difference in oxygen between the arterial blood and the venous blood is the extraction of O2 by the CO2 by the tissues. And this equation really sums it up. And we can rearrange this formula to solve for cardiac output if that's what we want to find. And in order to find cardiac output, well, what terms can we get, or what terms do we know how to get, first of all? Well, we can easily get VO2 using the Metcart. You guys have done that before. Now, we also need to get arterial O2 content, which we can get from any arterial oxygenated blood, and venous O2 content, which we need to get from the pulmonary artery. Now, we can get these by inserting catheters directly into the blood vessels, and if we did this, we would now have enough information to solve for cardiac output. Now, the obvious problem of doing this in lab is we need to use catheters that are directly inserted into the pulmonary artery, which obviously we can't do. So instead, we'll use the same theory and principles of what we just talked about and apply it to the production of carbon dioxide by the tissues rather than the extraction of oxygen. And if we do this, the equation now looks like this. And again, we can measure VCO2 very simply in the same manner by using a Metcart. Now, the arterial CO2 content is estimated from end-tidal CO2 during a normal period of ventilation. So the CO2 content at the end of your breath has been shown to be very close to the CO2 in the blood that leaves the lung. So the CO2 at the end of a normal breath, which can be easily measured, can be used as a good estimate for this term of arterial CO2. Now, these first two parameters are easy to estimate. However, it's difficult to estimate venous blood CO2, which is blood heading towards the lung. And this is hard to do just from expired gases. And this is where the CO2 rebreathe method comes into play. And this involves the subject breathing in and out of a bag. And the theory is, as you breathe in and out of the bag, you'll be breathing in more CO2 each breath, until eventually a point is reached in which the CO2 in the bag is in equilibrium with the CO2 in the venous blood arriving at the lung. Because at equilibrium, CO2 diffusion becomes zero, and the CO2 in the capillary blood can be assumed to be equal to the CO2 in the alveoli. Thus the venous CO2, or that term we need to finish the equation, can be predicted. And now we have all the terms to calculate Q. Okay? So today you'll be doing that in lab, and you'll be using the CO2 rebreathing technique to measure Q at rest and then actually at exercise. So we can examine the relationship between oxygen consumption and cardiac output at rest and at exercise.